an 80-year-old grandfather who murdered his wife of more than 50 years by hitting her over the head with a sledgehammer before setting her on fire in a car after telling her in spite about an affair decades earlier will likely die in prison after being jailed for life. Retired engineer David Clarke and his wife Helen, 77, were pulled from their burning Honda Jazz by firefighters as paramedics and police arrived at the scene in Sketty, Swansea, on September the 22nd last year. As she was dragged out of Mrs Clarke, told them, "My husband has done this. He has hit me on the head with a sledgehammer." Schoolchildren witnessed the carnage in a public street, and Clarke fought to stop emergency service workers saving his wife from the horrific death he had plotted days in advance, stocking the car with paraffin and lighters. Helen Clarke was treated by burn specialists but died from her injuries 2 days after the horror blaze. Clarke was sentenced to a minimum of 21 years and 8 months behind bars, having heard in an earlier hearing that he would likely never come out of jail. Deeply religious David Clarke, who met his wife at a church service, had been seen burning his church cassock in his garden fire pit days before the murder, and on the day of the killing texted their son to say "I love you" and "I'm sorry" to a female family friend whom he'd been regularly texting. After pleading guilty in December, Judge Paul Thomas KC said, "Mr Clarke will have already been told there can only be one sentence available, and that is one life of imprisonment." During a previous court hearing where he admitted murder, Clarke appeared via video link from a prison medical wing where he had his head and arm heavily wrapped in bandages. The court was told Clarke pushed a council worker away from the car as he tried to pull a screaming Helen out from the passenger seat before driving off in the burning car. The judge told Clarke his wife would have known she was dying. The married couple, who had 4 children, had returned to the UK 5 years ago to live in their dream seaside bungalow after spending most of their married life abroad, living in Zimbabwe. The 2 grandparents lived in a cottage in a beauty spot on the Gower Peninsula, less than a mile from where Catherine Zeta-Jones and Michael Douglas live when in Wales. During the sentencing hearing, prosecutor Michael Jones KC said Helen Clarke was born in Wolverhampton and later moved to Devon to work. He said an accident while out walking caused serious injuries to her ankle and caused her to walk with a limp. This limp later led to spinal problems. The court heard that although Helen Clarke was in poor health and looked old, she did not feel old in herself and always dressed flamboyantly and was young mentally. Mr Jones said she met David Clarke at the church service, both having converted to Catholicism and subsequently married. The prosecutor says they moved to Zambia in 1969 when David Clarke got a job there and later moved to Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe, in 1978. The Clarke's children were born while the family was overseas. The court was told there were difficulties in the marriage with arguments and sometimes physical fights, but that the pair mellowed with age. In 2018, the Clarkes moved back to the UK and went to live next to their son David in Langland in Swansea. The court hears the defendant confided in his son David that he had an affair while living in Africa and that he believed that he had a child from that relationship. Once in the UK, they became involved in a village life and joined Our Lady Star of the Sea Church in Mumbles. The court heard Helen and David Clarke celebrated their 53rd wedding anniversary in April 2023, and the family arranged the ceremony at the church in Mumbles, though Helen was apparently embarrassed about the ceremony. The prosecutor added that the defendant contacted the woman he had an affair with during their time in Africa. The woman, referred to only as Elle, who is now living in Australia. The court heard the defendant told Elle he would always love her to excess, and that each day his heart kissed her many times, and he'd even told his son that Elle was his soulmate. Son David tried to dissuade him from having more contact with the woman, but instead the defendant booked a trip to Australia. The court hears that from around April or May last year, David Clarke began sending inappropriate messages to a long-standing female friend of the couple and told her about his affair and the child he thought he had. In one message, the defendant demanded that the woman marry him. The court heard that he had become fixated with the idea he had grandchildren in Australia, and he and his wife flew to Australia. The court hears that while in Australia, the couple met Elle and her husband, but Helen Clarke knew nothing of the Africa affair. The prosecutor added that the couple flew home on September the 18th, and either at the airport before they left or during the flight, Clarke told his wife about the affair he had decades earlier. Their son David collected the couple from the Quadrant bus station in Swansea and drove them home, and the court hears in the days that followed there were arguments about the affair. On September the 20th, 2 days before the car fire, the defendant was seen burning family photographs and his church cassock in the fire pit in his back garden. The prosecutor said that their son David could see his parents' relationship was strained, but he had no particular concerns, even though his mother messaged him to say she wanted to move in with him. The court heard that at 7:05 a.m. on September the 22nd, the defendant sent his son David a text message saying "I love you," and sent the female family friend he had been texting a message saying "I'm sorry." The court was told at around 8 a.m. multiple witnesses, including a 15-year-old schoolboy, saw the Honda parked on the pavement. The prosecutor said a number of witnesses saw smoke coming from the boot of the car. One person reported hearing a scream, and another witness reported seeing a male at the open boot of the car and a green petrol can in the boot. Other witnesses reported seeing flames in the rear of the vehicle. A council worker arrived at the scene in his van and found a screaming woman slumped in the front seat of the burning car, shouting for help. He tried to drag her out. The defendant pushed him from the car, then drove off towards oncoming traffic, travelling some 30 metres before crashing into roadside bushes. The council worker described how the Honda then went up in a big ball of flames. As Mrs Clarke was pulled from the car by firefighters, there was a copious amount of blood on her head and lacerations on her forehead. She told them, "My husband has done this. He has hit me on the head with a sledgehammer." Mrs Clarke was asking her son and was becoming increasingly distressed, asking if he was safe. When told her husband was nearby, she replied, "No, not him. He is responsible for all of this. Get my son, get my son." The court hears Mrs Clarke then told the people who were helping her that the defendant had poured paraffin all over her and set her alight. the police recovered a hammer which was covered in blood and hair from near the entrance to Sketty Hall after it had been spotted by a passerby. Mrs Clarke was found to have burns to 58% of her body area, as well as 9 separate lacerations, some deep to her face and head. Her family were told her prognosis was poor, and at 6:30 p.m. the same evening were told her injuries were unsurvivable. The court heard that while being held on remand in Swansea prison, Clarke telephoned his son and described how he had hit his wife with a hammer to make her unconscious, but she just wouldn't go out. In impact statements read to the court, the Clarke's children, David and Laura, described the impact of their mother's murder at the hands of their father. They described the loss of their mother as a tragic, incomprehensive death. They say they cannot find the words to describe what the family has gone through and have been on a roller coaster of emotion since her death. They added that the reality is they have lost both their parents, with one parent being the victim and the other being the perpetrator. In mitigation, John Hipkin, KC, said Clarke is a man of 80 years of age with no previous convictions, added he pleaded guilty at an early stage of the proceedings. The barrister says it is clear that his client loved Helen Clarke and provided and cared for his family for many years. Judge Paul Thomas, KC, tells Clarke that in September last year, he murdered his wife in a brutal and merciless manner on a busy Swansea street, hitting her to the head with a sledgehammer 9 times before dousing her with petrol and other substance and setting fire to her. He told Clarke he had known that what he was doing to his wife 50 years would cause her unimaginable pain and suffering. He says that during the marriage, Clarke had been aggressive and on occasions violent towards his wife despite his outward veneer of respectability and his professed religious faith. Judge Thomas told Clarke he had known exactly what he was doing on the day in question and says there was a degree of planning in taking the lighters and petrol can with him. He says the physical proximity Clarke had to his victim as he doused her in accelerant and set the fire in the car made it different to other cases of arson leading to death. The judge says the very public location chosen for the murder, a busy street with pupils making their way to nearby school, was a significant factor, as was the fact Clarke had taken steps to stop people from trying to save his wife. He said Mrs Clarke would have been in excruciating pain during the incident and would have known she was going to die. South Wales Police Detective Chief Inspector Paul Rakes said this has been a challenging investigation due to its nature and circumstances. To this end, I would like to place on record our condolences to the family of Helen Clarke and thank them for their cooperation and understanding during extremely difficult times for them. Please like this video, please comment, and I would love it if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you.